Hello and welcome to NIDA Awareness Week, where everybody has a seat at the table. I'm Ryan Sheldon, a motivational speaker, Brawn model, NIDA ambassador, and today I'm the moderator for We Are Here, Now Hear Us, Voices from the Fat Community panel. Before we get started, I want to introduce the esteemed panelists for today's discussion. First, we have Nia Patterson. Nia is an eating disorder recovery and mental health advocate. She has spent the past 4 years documenting her recovery from bulimia, OCD, PTSD, and bipolar disorder on Instagram and in various speeches. Nia also has a podcast called Body Trauma. Next, we have Sandy Sahar Guin, is a performing artist and educator in recovery from an eating disorder. His advocacy focuses on marginalized groups and underrepresented communities in the eating disorder field, especially those he's a part of, which include LGBT, men, Jewish, higher weight, and disabled groups. Carly Stong is a registered yoga teacher, as well as the educational director and lead instructor at Yoga Teacher Training Kingston. As a passionate advocate for body positivity, Carly teaches about anti-oppression for yoga studios and movement instructors. Her approach to inclusion is modern and informed by a fully embodied and integrated experience. Thank you all for being here today to discuss the important topic that does not get enough coverage. So let's just jump right in. First, I want to talk about the words higher weight and the word fat. There seems to be so many different opinions about these labels, and I wanted to ask you guys what your thoughts were on this. So let's just start. Anybody jump in?
I'll start. I don't have personally any commitment to either terms like fat or bigger bodied or higher weight, or any other terms that could be synonymous with being higher weight, fat, bigger bodied, and so on. I think for me, what matters more is the person who's speaking, what their intention is behind that language. And also, just like with somebody's pronouns, if someone were to say to me that they prefer to be referred to as fat or as plus sized or as something like that, I would make it a priority to keep their preferences in mind. But for me personally, I'm more concerned with somebody's intention behind the words, because historically I think the word fat is kind of the other F word and has been used to stigmatize and uh, but really it's just an adjective, like, blonde.
Totally. Anyone else have any thoughts?
Definitely. I have worked to reclaim the word fat for myself, instead of thinking that it was a bad word or that it meant that I was ugly or disgusting, or all of the other adjectives that kind of are behind the word fat. I've worked to reclaim it for myself to, as Carly said, just be an adjective. And so I openly call myself fat. I'm not afraid to be called fat, but I also don't really like it when people in smaller bodies call me fat, because it feels like there is some sort of stigma behind that word. And so that makes me uneasy. But when referring to myself, when referring to other fat people, I usually prefer the word fat or larger bodied or higher weight.
I similarly feel like I don't really have a preference, but I respect other people's terms that they would use. And I also similarly don't always know how to respond. Intent matters, obviously, but when people in smaller bodies use the word fat, I don't always know that I am okay with that for myself.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you for all of that insight. Why do you think it's important for higher weight people in the fat community to have a seat at this table?
I mean, I'm assuming we're talking the eating disorder table, and I think that, whew, I mean, I think that just fat people are overlooked as either not having an eating disorder, not having the right eating disorder, not, showing discipline and therefore not really being sick. I know that like all of these reasons were in my head in college when I first realized that I might haven't, well, I did have an eating disorder, but in my mind I said I might have an eating disorder, because in my mind I was just trying to lose weight and I wasn't really sick. I didn't have a problem because I was just in a fat body trying to lose weight, whereas other people who I knew were obviously sick because they looked like they had an eating disorder or their body fit within the DSM guidelines. And I think that's so problematic because it just isolates such a large community from getting help. And I think that since a majority of the country is fat, that would mean most likely that a majority of the people with eating disorders are also fat. And if we're isolating them, then we're isolating the largest population who needs help. And that is just so problematic. And I mean, someone needs to speak up for them and be there for them.
Yeah, I totally agree with Nia. I think that um, both fat populations and those with eating disorders and that combine are highly stigmatized conditions. And as a result, those stigmatizing attitudes and beliefs are still they manifest in the stakeholders, the policymakers and the public health professionals and so on, including healthcare providers. So I think that fat people ought to be part of the conversation because there really needs to be a bottom-up approach to public health interventions, both there's integrated promotion efforts that could happen that focus on shared risk like low self-esteem and body dissatisfaction, as well as protective factors like regular movement practices and developing a healthier relationship with eating. And the treatments for both conditions right now, I think, are suboptimal. And like Nia mentioned, the risk for fat bodies of eating disorder is an increased risk than the general population. So I think it would be it needs to be the public opinion really needs to be solicited in the course of policy development so that those stigmas and those attitudes and beliefs can really start to be uprooted from the bottom up.
I absolutely echo what both of you said, and I wanted to add to that fat phobia is very prevalent even in health at every size treatment spaces, recovery spaces. And I think that that is a conversation that's had very quietly, but I think maybe needs to be a more broadly had conversation, especially in my treatment experience. A phrase that I heard very often said to other clients, patients, whatever you want to say, is we're not going to let you get fat. Don't worry. Like that attitude to try to quell other people's body dysmorphia at the expense of fat people. I think that is a common problem. And I think that, as was said, since there are a lot of fat people with eating disorders, a lot higher weight people with eating disorders, maybe moving away from that framework, talking like that might be beneficial, is beneficial.
Definitely.
Thank you for
Also,
sharing.
Also, just the fact that not only are like people in treatment centers saying these things to clients in smaller bodies, but they're saying it directly in front of people in larger bodies. Like they're saying like, don't worry, we won't make you look like this other person in the room who I've determined is disgusting. Like, and so how is that person supposed to get adequate treatment if they're being told the whole time that even when they're getting help, that they still are less than and just like disgusting.
Yeah, what all of you said makes like a lot of sense. And also, like, for me, it took me so long to get diagnosed with an eating disorder because my doctor could not understand how I could be struggling with an eating disorder just by looking at me. And that was like, so that was, looking back, it's outrageous. I obviously I no longer go to that doctor anymore, but it took so long. It was me that kept having to bring up this conversation of, I think there's something wrong with me. And then as soon as you do that and you get turned down, you kind of like don't want to do it again because it's a really scary thing. But finally I was diagnosed. So I think what all of you are saying is totally accurate. So then how do you think the lack of representation perpetuated stereotypes about eating disorders?
Well, I think the when certain health promotion messages that are targeted to fat people or higher weight people are in direct conflict to those with certain eating disorders and certain health promotion messages. So with like both of the other panelists mentioned in their own experiences, that the message for higher weight populations is on the body weight and or on their diet, whereas when with the health promotion messages for people with eating disorders, there's a reduced focus on body weight and diet. So I think that one of the, like I mentioned earlier, the biggest hurdle that we have to get over in this field is this like disassociation between fat people and those with eating disorders, because one is treated like a public health issue and the other is treated like a mental health issue. And when something is a public health issue, there's like a personal responsibility, and all of those fat phobic judgments regarding, you know, fat people as lazy, as unmotivated, as having a brain fart, as lazy, as unmotivated, as unable to stick to goals that they've set, and so on. That's all a personal responsibility. Whereas when something is dealt with in the field of clinical psychology, there's a lot of support to uproot what's at the foundation of these coping strategies and coping mechanisms. And so I think there's a real disconnect between those two fields that needs we need to keep trying to kind of merge them together.
I was asking if anybody else has any thoughts about that, about the lack of representation and how that's perpetuated the stereotypes. I think, like, for an example, like just like watching the like media TV shows, you always see the same characters playing the same roles. Or like, it's, I mean, I keep thinking of This Is Us and watching, you know, like the white fat female and Christy Metz, and it's like that's perpetuating the problem. They're showing the stereotypes of who is struggling with eating disorders, and it continues and it trickles down. It would be like really interesting to see, you know, men play these characters and just not the stereotypes that you are so used to seeing.
Oh, yeah. I would also say that even I feel sometimes clinicians have their own stereotypes because of representation of a hierarchy of between disorders, like which ones are more serious, and also what body type can have what disorder. I think that is a common problem. Like they reduce it to numbers of a breakdown, especially by gender, by weight, by all these things. They're like, you must have X disorder because you're this, and they can't see past statistics. But each person with an eating disorder's experience is important, I think, is something that gets lost.
And in the media, I think, I'm sorry, Sandy.
No, you're good. You're good.
In the media, I think it tends to be like a big joke, like the fat person puts on the skimpy swimsuit or the tight shorts, and nobody wants to tell them, you know, that they ought to be embarrassed about how they look, or the fat best friend tries to put themselves out there and is like, you know, is not able to achieve the same goals. They can't have the same goals. They can't expect the same outcomes. You don't often see them being lead characters. I think all of that lends to the commentary of size discrimination and weight bias and weight stigma, which then we see again from the bottom up right up to the healthcare providers.
Totally. You like, I think of Jonah Hill when you said that, because I remember how he was known as the fat guy in Hollywood, and he played all of the funny characters and the funny roles, and then he lost all of this weight, and then I don't think he was booking any jobs. And then I just watched this interview with him recently. I don't know if you've seen it on Instagram, where somebody asks him like, "Are you still known as the fat guy in Hollywood?" And he stopped the interview right there. It's shocking to see that, you know, people are only getting placed as characters if like as the funny sidekick character is if they're, you know, fat or overweight.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that too, that that weight stigma, it's like the last acceptable social stigma that we can all still laugh about, you know. We can all still agree that we can laugh at that person for getting stuck in a kayak or something like that in the media representation. And then second to that, outside of like the scripted scenes, there's like the people who make the news because they've lost all that weight. So I think of like Rebel Wilson recently, who like went who's like amazing transformation and like her new healthy lifestyle, and that that discourse that pulses through media as well.
I also think it like starts at the top, really. Like we have to like continuously, like there has to be more, you know, fat advocates and people out there talking about this. Really, it starts at the top. So I think that if we can continue to push that, that will break through the barriers.
Well, and even sometimes I think that can be problematic, because those who in the like greater public that are seen as like fat advocates, they're often a specific type of fat also. Like they're a specific proportion, like plus size models I can think of. You don't see very many size 26 plus size models. It's like a size 16 or like 18, and they're still specific hourglass proportions. I'm speaking of like for women. And then with men, you don't often see bigger bodied models unless it's like the dad bod, you know, and it's still not taken seriously as something that could be sexualized or something that could be like thought of in the same way that other media portrayals are thought of. You know, it can't be something to aspire to. And so even those who I sometimes see put on like a pedestal by the general media, like the wider media, which I see is like represented a lot by like thin people, are you know, they're like fat advocates, but for actual fat people, I don't know that they're always the best advocates.
There's also, I think Lizzo recently came out with you know, talking, I forget exactly what it was, but she was tired of being an advocate, like a fat advocate, just because she was fat. Like nobody else, she felt like she wasn't being viewed in any other light. And I don't know if anybody has experienced that with their advocacy work that they do currently.
I don't know if I've really experienced it in that way, because I feel like I specifically talk about advocacy for fat bodies. So if someone saw me as a fat advocate, that would make sense. But like, I think if I were like a musician or like an actress or something where I'm just trying to like make my living and do what I want to do with my life, and people are automatically like stamping me with the title of like fat advocate, or like, oh, she's so brave, she's so confident, like if it was one of those things, like then yeah, then I'd be probably tired of it and really annoyed. And I think also, like when you're in the public eye, like people just zoom in on every single thing you do. And so when Lizzo came out like a month ago or something and was doing like a detox fast, like if it were any other thin person online, like no one would have an issue with it. It would just be the Kardashians doing flat tummy tea again. But because she's like supposedly being held up as this fat advocate, everyone like came after her, and she's just like, let me live my life. Like it's like your body has to stand for something more if you are like like a fat person with a following in the world, and that is so frustrating and just kind of demeaning.
That's so well put. Yeah. I think bodies are always politicized, right? And so what you wear, how you express yourself, the color of your hair, the color of your skin, and there's no exception when it comes to the size of your body either.
Hmm.
So do you think that people that are in larger size bodies are held to different expectations and different standards than people that are not in larger size bodies?
Yes. I think I know what you're saying. I think yes, because I mean it's assumed that if you're in a fat body, you are constantly every moment of every day trying to change that body. So I think that you are being held to that standard, but also just like I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I feel like you're always being held to some standard if you're in a fat body, that like you change it or you speak up for it, or like you represent all fat people. Like it's never just your body. And I know this like is specifically a panel for like higher weight, but like it's the same idea as like being a Black person and you speaking for the entire Black community if you say one thing, and seeing all Black people as a monolith, um seeing all fat people as, like Carly said, like lazy and like unmotivated. These are all just like a stamp that they place on all fat people just from the beginning.
It's interesting in my experience, are they held to a different standard? Um, it's an interesting question, but I know in my experience, certainly I completely agree with what Nia was saying, that like if people are asking me to speak on behalf of fat populations, that's my job, that's what I do. And but often what I see as I'm teaching yoga or teaching workshops is that people of all sized bodies have benefited from this work, because like I mentioned before, it shares an underlying, it can share an underlying theme of like of your self-image, of your coping strategies, of your mental health. And as these issues come out through the lens of like a bigger bodied person, all people are like, wow, it was so inspiring to see you wearing a bikini. I can't even, I haven't swam in 12 years because I can't even don a bathing suit. And I hear comments like that, where like the work that I'm doing and is brave or is inspiring. And that's sort of like lends to what you were saying as like, are fat people held to, all I'm doing is swimming, but it's brave because I've put on a bathing suit as a fat person. But I hear the impact that it has on people of all sizes, because I think that body image issues is just so, it's such a problem for a plethora of people, it kind of regardless of your size.
Yeah, I guess like when I asked it, I was kind of maybe I didn't word it right, but everything you both said made complete sense. And I think it's like I guess I'm just used to being held to, like, there's so many expectations when I come around a certain group of people, potentially because of my size. Oh, Ryan is the funny guy, he's known as this one, and it's maybe because I've had to overcompensate because of the way I felt about my body for such a long time. It's like
Yeah.
always overcompensating.
Also, just to like piggyback on what Carly said, I've been thinking about this often because I've been kind of I'm always advocating for people in fat bodies, but in particular, I've been calling people out who are doing problematic things with how they're leading recovery spaces, where they're just centering people in small bodies, and they're centering their experiences and like what they need for recovery, and kind of just pushing what fat people need to the side. And I've had to like say multiple times that like when we're treating eating disorders, when we're doing recovery, we have to be catering like our work to the most marginalized people. We have to be catering to the person with all of the target identities. Like we can't just treat the small white woman. We have to treat the person who's the most marginalized, because not only are they overlooked, but by treating them, the work will benefit everyone else with more privilege. Whereas if you only treat the person with the most privilege, it doesn't benefit the person with the least amount of privilege.
Really well said, Nia.
Yeah, Sandy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would also say, in terms of like the double standard, and like the perfect example I have of double standard, and as I was saying before, in treatment spaces, I, based on my, I was given like the like honor to like be treated based on my symptoms, but a lot of larger bodied people at this same place were being told, oh, it's not that big a deal comparatively. And also like, again, disorder dependent, like BED is just kind of written off by a lot of people in a really unfortunate way. Regardless of the body size of people, like I don't struggle with it, but I know a lot of people that do, and I've watched how everyone, but especially larger body people with that disorder, can sometimes be held to a different standard as not as sick, and I think that that's unfortunate. But also just generally, I do think that sometimes people in larger bodies are not taken as seriously in these spaces, and also just generally in health environments for non-eating disorder related things. I think is another area where it's just like, oh, you broke your leg, why don't you just go lose some weight? It's like, that's not going to do anything.
Yeah, well said, makes sense. So I guess, what advice would each of you have to give to higher weight or fat people who have an eating disorder and who are looking for help and a community?
Well, I think that the panel has really reinforced the idea that it is never acceptable to or deserved to, if you find yourself the target of weight discrimination or weight bias or weight stigma, and so to seek treatment, just as I think most people would advise anybody with an eating disorder to seek treatment, so that these messages have less power. And there's the NEDA helpline. They can call, they can chat, they can text. This is a mental health issue. And so what will provide relief from the eating disorder is treatment that improves coping skills, and interest in self-care, and restrictive dieting, or increased exercise, or the general advice that might be given to in a public health sphere for larger bodies. That's not going to provide the relief. The outcome from mental health support is living a life of sound mental health and stability, and those are changes that truly improve daily life when you can seek the proper help.
I would say that if you think that you have an eating disorder and that you might need help, like, then chances are you have an issue. Like you have an eating disorder, or you have some sort of disordered relationship with food, because eating disorders fight tooth and nail for you not to get help, for you not to think you're sick. And so if you have the awareness that you think you might be sick, that means that you're actually doing a lot worse and need more help than your eating disorder would probably let you think. And so if you think you need help, definitely do whatever you can to get help. It is very hard to go to treatment and get support, but there are a lot of options out there that are possible for helping going to treatment or getting support, whether it's outpatient or residential, PHP. There are ways to get support, but even if it's talking to like just your regular therapist about eating disorders and asking them if they know anyone who can help, that is an amazing place to start.
And I would also say that you shouldn't have to wait until you've like had a drastic change in your size to be deemed worthy of care. Like that's just like try to find the people that's not going to be the deciding factor for you to get help.
Totally. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I do have a question. I think talking about, well, I know from my experience, talking about eating disorders in general can be really, like embarrassing or shameful to some degree. And then add the fact that you're in a higher weight body, that just makes it even more kind of embarrassing and shameful. Because in my experience, when I've told people that I struggle with an eating disorder, they look at me like I have 17 eyeballs, because how can you have an eating disorder, which we already talked about. But what advice would you give to people that maybe are not in a higher weight body, that have thin privilege, that want to talk to their friends who may be in a higher weight body about an eating disorder? How do they even start that conversation? Or if their friend is open to talking about it, how do both parties feel comfortable about it? Like, how do they educate themselves?
I'm curious whether you mean like talking to their friend saying like, oh, I have an eating disorder and I'm in a smaller body, or whether they're saying, I think you might have an eating disorder and you're in a larger body.
No, it's the first way. The first one. Thanks. Sorry. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah.
I want to turn to my panelists for that answer, because I think they have lended their experiences so well up to now. I'd be curious to hear how they respond.
I mean, I think part of me wants to say that like if you are in a smaller body and you benefit from thin privilege and you feel like you might have an eating disorder and you need support, it might not be the time to go to your fat friends and tell them like, oh, I feel really fat. Or tell them like, I'm really afraid of gaining weight. If you truly value your fat friends. I think that there's so much support out there outside of just like your one. I mean, maybe you have like three, I don't know, but like outside of like that fat friend, there's so much other support for you, that I think going and getting other support, learning, following people on Instagram and fat bodies before you necessarily go to your fat friend and say things that could harm them. Because I think, especially at the beginning of recovery or even just like self-awareness of an eating disorder, you have a lot of words coming out of your mouth that are problematic because it's your eating disorder running the show. And I think at that point, like, you don't know what is harmful. And so you could do more harm to your friendships than I believe that you would want to do.
Thank you for sharing that.
I would say, especially because I've had, friends, whether or not they knew that I also had an eating disorder, who've come to me who are in smaller bodies. I would say from experience that a really good way to talk about it is, just speaking again from personal experience and not trying to then like rope your friend like into it. Being non-judgmental, and again, like not saying things like I feel fat, because last time I checked, fat is not a feeling. Things like that, I would echo, are not the right way to talk about it. But I would say, you know, it is okay if they are people close to you to like talk about like the internalized stuff that you may be experiencing. Maybe not like putting it all on your friend, but like talking it out. I think if your friend is okay with doing that, I think it's a good place to be in.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I know from other experiences that I've had talking about like our trauma and our is that I find really beneficial is to say, like, I can remember when the pandemic started, a friend of mine saying, "Oh, I just read this thing online that talked about like predictions for the future, like outcomes of this pandemic, you know, and how long we'll be in lockdown and so on. Is that something that you want to talk? Is that something you want to hear?" And I think that like speaking about what you want to talk about instead of just talking about it. And again, that speaks to what Nia was saying, that like that takes um a pretty balanced state of mental health, I think, to be able to recognize that what you want to talk about might be harmful to another person, because I think sometimes when you're in crisis, it can be all consuming. And but I think that might be a really beneficial thing here too. If I had a friend that I knew had a history of eating disorders and I wanted to speak to them because maybe I thought I might also have an eating disorder, I think it would be a great idea to say to them, you know, I'd like to talk to somebody about that. Is that something I can talk to you about?
Mm-hmm.
That's really good feedback. You know, I have a friend who has the cultural ideal body, like the six pack when I say that, and he sits there and talks to me all the time about how he's not doing well on his diet or how he feels like he got fat this week because he didn't work out one day. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking like, what? Why are you telling me this? But then I also, maybe it's because I'm already through like recovery, I don't know, but I also start to think like, okay, like obviously he's going through something as well. He clearly has, you know, issues when it comes to his body and eating. So like give him the benefit of the doubt, but that's just me versus someone who, another two friends that I have, one is fat and the other one is extremely thin. And she says that the thin friend said she didn't want to go to the pool today because she felt fat. And it really triggered my fat friend because it turned into this huge fight. And it was just really interesting to see how you know, recognize how some people recognize thin privilege, and obviously privilege in general. Yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah.
I work in theater. People regularly talk about their weight, like the number out loud, like that's normalized at work. So I'm just kind of
When I have experiences like that, I always think like, boy, am I glad I've done the work. Like this would be a really difficult thing for somebody who hasn't done the work or is like in it to be hearing. So from that place of privilege, I do, if I'm feeling strong on that day, I'll take the opportunity to speak up for the people who maybe are, who might hear something like that and be really hurt. I remember a few summers ago, I was walking down the street and in this cute like black and white jumper, and from a car driving by, somebody mooed at me. And my response to that was like, what is happening to that poor, like I want to pull over and be like, do you need me to call your mom? Like, are you okay? Because I thought like, what could possibly, how much hatred and like, you know, just venom that somebody must have inside of them to drive by somebody, a stranger on the street. And I was so grateful for having done so much work. And I wrote a whole blog post about it because it's that type of thing that I think we can use our that's where your bravery can be really beneficial, that on days where you're feeling strong and in control and balanced, that you can speak up for those who maybe who are like in the position we're talking about, those who might want to seek help. We can speak on webinars or on as panelists like this, you know.
Yeah, I think it's like the educational component also, right? It's like how much more do we have to continue to educate people when it comes to, again, other things, but specifically speaking about, you know, being in a higher weight body. It's just educating them that eating disorders can affect anyone. They do not discriminate, and it's exhausting. So I look at it as also like an educational thing, and the source that is getting like starting to look back in time and think like, when did fat even become a bad thing? Is it even a bad thing? It's like, it's this whole history of fat and what it means to other people, I guess.
And Ryan, on the days that it's exhausting, that's why we need to lean on each other. That you have a network of people like Nita and the people who are in that network who can do the advocacy work for us, because it isn't always our responsibility.
Great.
Yes.
Anything else that anybody wants to add? Any other topics that anybody else wants to bring up?
I think
Great.
we could probably
Well,
talk forever about it, but
so I'm trying to like stay within their guidelines. Okay, well, you know, thank you so much for joining this important discussion, and we hope that everyone watching found this information helpful. Tune in throughout the week for more NITA awareness roundtable discussions. Thanks, everyone.